If right now, while you're reading these seemingly harmless lines, Satan steps in, not with smoke or thunder, but with a cold demand from the spiritual realm. I claim that part of the soul, the part not surrendered. What do you have to stand firm? Welcome to Prayer Station. This is not a legend, not a parable, but a single verse in the Bible recording a confrontation between Michael and the devil. The Lord rebuke you. No blood, no sword, and yet an invisible battle that made heaven and hell collide. A corpse is still being claimed. An angel speaks just 4 words, and darkness retreats. Why would Satan demand a corpse? Why didn't Michael fight back? The answer begins on a desolate mountain, with a man who once spoke face to face with God, and a funeral with no mourners, only the Creator. His name was Moses, and the story he left behind is still unfolding inside you. Because what the darkness demands is not the part that died, it's the part you haven't surrendered. Are you ready to enter the battle history tried to hide? The sun had set behind the hills of Moab. The day's final light faded into the evening mist like a silent farewell to the one whom all of Israel revered. Here on Mount Pisgah had become the final boundary not only between earth and sky, but between what was and what is to come. Moses stood there, his body weary from 120 years of obedience. Before him was Canaan, the promised land he had heard of, preached about, dreamed of, but would never enter. And then, he fell. No one witnessed it, no trumpet sounded, no funeral, no wreaths. But something strange occurred. The Lord himself came. Not in a blazing form that shook the mountains. He came not to judge, but like a friend drawing near to a faithful soul. God didn't need to say much. Just a look, a wordless whisper, and rest filled the air. Then Scripture records a detail that made heaven and earth fall silent. The Lord buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, and to this day no one knows where his grave is. Why didn't God allow Joshua, his successor, or the elders to bury him? Why no national funeral, no mourners, no tombstone for future generations to honor? Because Moses was not just a man, he was a symbol, a shadow of the law, and that is precisely why God hid his body. Before he was the one who parted the waters, he was the child drifting on a river. Before he became the man who split the Red Sea, he was one of mixed blood, a Hebrew body raised in Egyptian silk. Moses was born in a suffocating moment of history when the cries of Hebrew baby boys were silenced by drowning in the Nile. But he did not die. A small basket soaked in water and hope carried him into the very heart of power, Pharaoh's palace. There, Moses grew up in 2 worlds. He studied Egyptian literature, understood court laws, but his heart did not belong to the throne. He was a prince, but his soul throbbed with the groans of slaves. And when he saw a Hebrew being beaten, he struck down the Egyptian soldier. The first blood spilled was not in war, but in a moment where he chose his people over power. The act of murder made him a fugitive, but that very flight led him to his eternal appointment, the wilderness. In the quiet days of shepherding, a bush burned yet was not consumed, and everything changed. From the fire, God called his name, Moses, Moses, and he replied, "Here I am." It wasn't the voice of a hero, but of a man who was broken. A man who no longer believed he was worthy of doing anything great. But it is the broken whom God uses to break chains. He didn't need to be a great orator. He needed someone who would obey. He didn't need a strategic leader. He needed someone willing to turn his back on himself. When Moses stood before Pharaoh, he did not speak for himself. He said, "The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says, 'Let my people go.'" Each plague upon Egypt wasn't just to free a people, but to declare this one truth: no God can stand against Yahweh. Then came the great moment. The Red Sea opened, not by the power of Moses' staff, but by the faith of a man who lifted it, believing the waters would part even when death stood before him. On Mount Sinai, he walked alone into the thick cloud, into thunder and lightning, to hear the word of God, etched not just on stone tablets, but onto the heart. The 10 Commandments were not the first set of laws. They were a covenant between a holy God and a stiff-necked people. And standing between that covenant was Moses. He was the mediator between the people and God, between groans and thunder, between sin and mercy. Among all the prophets in the Bible, no one was described like Moses. No prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He wasn't just used by God, he was known by him. They spoke like friends. God once changed his mind about destroying the people because Moses interceded. Moses once dared to ask for something no one else had: "Show me your glory." And God let him see his back, "For no one may see my face and live." Moses wasn't just a servant of God, he was a shadow of the one to come, the eternal mediator between humanity and God. When he failed at Meribah, it wasn't just an act of anger. He struck the rock instead of speaking to it. That rock was Christ. The relationship between action and symbol is deeply sacred in Scripture. Every act, every image in the Old Testament reflects the one to come. And Moses, in weariness, unintentionally distorted the image of the new covenant. That's why he could not enter the promised land. Not because God was angry, but because of something more sacred. The law can bring you to the threshold, but it cannot take you in. He was the embodiment of the law, and only grace, through Joshua, could lead the people into the promise. If Moses' body had been found, what would people have done? They would have built a shrine. They would have turned memory into an idol. Just like they once did with the golden calf, they would have bowed to a relic instead of lifting their eyes to the Holy One. And so, God hid Moses' body. He covered the sacred so that what is good would not become corrupted. Moses' body wasn't just a corpse. It was a living memory, a symbol of an age that had passed. If it were possessed by Satan or by human hearts, it could become the root of a demonic religion. Moses, the man who once stood between God and the people, now lies between two realms: physical and spiritual, memory and reality, death and life. But the spirit realm is not at peace, because one still wants to claim his body. And that's where the story shifts. From remembrance to war. An invisible confrontation between Michael and Satan, not for a soul, but for a memory, for a meaning, for a symbol that could lead a generation to God or forever astray. And if Satan dared to fight an angel over a lifeless body, do you think he'll ignore the part of your life you're still hiding? Not all mistakes are the same. Some may seem small, yet they can shift the entire course of redemptive history. The people complained of thirst, a familiar scene in the wilderness, barrenness, grumbling, and patience on trial. The Lord instructed, "Speak to the rock, and it will pour out water." But instead of speaking, Moses struck the rock twice. This was not merely an act of anger. It was a deviation from a sacred symbol. Because according to 1 Corinthians 10:4, Paul writes, "That rock was Christ, a shadow set in the wilderness foretelling the one to come. Christ, the living rock, did not need to be struck twice. He only needed to be spoken of. Struck once so that living water would flow, that was Golgotha. But struck again would distort the meaning of the cross. Moses' sin seemed small, yet it impacted something far greater, the symbolic order of the covenant. Moses was the representative of the law. He had received the tablets from the very hand of God, but he also broke them when he saw the people worshiping the golden calf. And now, he distorted the image of the one who was promised. The law cannot fulfill what it prophesies. It brings people to the edge of the promised land, but cannot take them in. Just like Moses, the law can look in but not cross over. Moses' body can be seen as the final mobile ark of the covenant from the old era. A sacred vessel carrying living memories of the law, of ordinances, of the relationship between man and God through commandment. But that old ark could not be opened in the new era. Why? Because if it were opened, people would seek glory from what had passed. They would bow to old symbols. They would continue living in fear instead of grace. That's why God had to hide Moses' body. Just as he later allowed the Ark of the Covenant to vanish for centuries, not to be worshipped, not to be mythologized. Every act of God is not just an action, but a symbol. No detail is wasted. And the death of Moses, along with God himself burying him, was a profound spiritual ordinance. It marked the end of the law and a safeguard against misdirected worship. His body was not unknown because it was unworthy, but because it was too worthy. So worthy that if someone possessed it, they would turn it into a distorted theology, where people return to the dead roots instead of moving forward into the living covenant. But there is a force that doesn't care about the meaning behind the symbol. He has no concern for theology. He doesn't need to understand the Old or New Testament. He knows only one thing. If a physical object can lead to false worship, he will take it. And so, Satan appears, not to kill, but to claim, not to save, but to possess. He didn't want Moses' soul. He wanted the body, because he understood a truth more terrifying than any sermon. Distorted memory is the foundation of a twisted belief. And if he could turn Moses into a god, then an entire generation would bow to the very one who once led them to follow the Lord. Are you ready to step into the darkest part of the story? Not every grave is silent. There are bodies cold and motionless that still make all of hell tremble. Because they are not just flesh, but memory. Not just matter, but symbol. And if memory is seized, the symbol is distorted. And from that, unclean spirits are born. Memory reclaimed right after Moses took his last breath, before anyone could mourn, before the sun could fully set behind Pisgah. A different darkness arose, not the night, but a presence, an invisible smoke silently seeping into sacred space like a choking cloud for the soul. Satan, the accuser of all ages, had arrived. Not to welcome a soul, not to wage war, not to grieve. He came to claim the body. This body is mine. He disobeyed at Meribah. He struck the symbol. He broke the covenant. In his hand was no sword, but a legal scroll, written in the language of accusation. Every word, every action, every moment of Moses' doubt and anger was listed like a debt unpaid. But his true aim was not justice. It was control of memory. Satan knew the Israelites. He had watched them for centuries. He knew they were easily seduced by what they could see. Moses vanished for just 40 days and they cast a golden calf. So what if they saw his real body untouched by decay? What then? A temple, a pilgrimage center, a form of worship centered on a corpse. Let his body be buried among us. Build a shrine at his resting place. Let memory become ritual. And just like that, memory is no longer pure. It becomes a symbol. And that symbol, if not guarded, opens a door to unclean spirits. When good becomes a tool for darkness, Satan does not create new idols. He reuses old blessings. What was once a blessing, he twists into division. What was once a staff of deliverance, he turns into a scepter of pride. What was once the bones of the righteous, he lifts as an idol. He doesn't need to break in with fire, only a place to plant a distorted memory. If he could obtain Moses' body, he would gain a foothold in the history of faith. When people start praying to Moses instead of crying out to God, when they kneel at a tomb instead of seeking true presence, then the symbol becomes a shadow. The body, gateway to meaning. Everybody holds a sacred program, and Moses, the final symbol of the law, had to be hidden. Not because he had lost value, but because that value was too great to be misused. That's why God buried him with his own, not for the people to find, not for the world to build temples, not for Satan to gain a foothold. And because of this, Satan was enraged. He had a plan, a strategy to seize memory, twist the symbol, and build a new religion around an old body. But that plan was stopped. And he would not remain silent. He demanded, "He is unworthy. I have a right to this body." And from the spiritual realm, whispers soaked in accusation rose like toxic mist over the valley of Moab. But heaven would not stay silent for long. When the darkness seemed poised to win, when the charges were unleashed word by word, slicing through sacred memory, a quiet sound stirred in the spirit realm. Not thunder, not a sword drawn, but a presence. And then a figure stepped in, not to argue, not to refute the accusations, but to stand. Between holiness and shadow, Michael, the Archangel, the one whose name is the question that shakes all of hell. Who is like God? He carried no authority of his own. He did not defend the man. He carried only one thing, complete surrender to the supreme authority. And in that moment, the space itself compressed. The spirit realm held its breath. Because what was about to happen was not a battle, but the enforcement of an eternal principle. Prepare yourself, because in the silence, unspoken words are waiting to explode. Not every battle begins with a shout. Some battles begin with silence. A space between Moab, where winds once howled, the earth once quaked, the spirit realm once roared, is now compressed like a courtroom awaiting its verdict. No one dares to breathe. No angel dares to move. Satan stands, indictment in hand, and the accusation hangs suspended like a sharpened blade in the air. But within that soundless realm, a presence draws near. No echo, no thunder, no introduction needed. Each step alone is enough to make the darkness recoil. Michael. His name is a question, and also a declaration. Michael, who is like God. Michael did not come with weapons. He did not come with flashy power. He came with something Satan will never comprehend. He bore no power, only position. Michael did not stand there as some spiritual superpower. He did not proclaim himself Archangel. He offered no arguments, no dialogue, because Michael did not represent himself. He stood on behalf of a sacred principle. True authority flows not from power, but from surrender. Satan does not understand this. He once bore the name Morning Star, but fell because he wanted to be like God. Michael is different. He knows exactly who he is and who he is not. He did not stand to win, but to uphold the position he was assigned, and in that moment between hell's demand and heaven's silence, Michael stepped into the compressed space like a word waiting to be spoken. Angels held their breath. The spiritual realm was so still one could hear a word not yet uttered. This was no longer a clash of two forces. This was a sacred courtroom where every word carries weight and every posture echoes into eternity. Michael did not summon armies, because true power needs no noise. True authority needs no display. His presence was like a light entering a divine courtroom. Not blinding, but enough to expose every speck of spiritual dust. Michael's presence stood in total contrast to Satan's strategy, while the accuser relied on voice, data, details, and logic. Michael entered like a holy silence, where quiet is not absence but the storing up of a verdict that will overturn everything. Not all silence is surrender. Some silence is the beginning of victory. Like Jesus before Pilate, not defending himself yet holding judgment over the world. Like Job in painful silence, yet keeping faith that shattered hell's schemes. And now Michael only needed to stand. When Satan demanded the body of Moses, he wasn't just asking for flesh. He was demanding the right to redefine history, to twist a symbol into distorted memory, to claim a vessel and build a temple of worship unto himself. Michael knew this, and he stood like a gatekeeper, refusing to let a generation walk into deception. There are moments when no grand action is needed. Just standing in the right place at the right time on the right side, it is enough to stop a spiritual disaster from echoing across generations. And then, everything fell silent. No voice from heaven, no beam of light, just an angel standing between the claim of darkness and the rest of a righteous man. Do you think this is the end? Number. Because heaven is preparing to speak. And when that word breaks forth, all hell will tremble. The sentence about to be spoken, just 4 words, will seal the indictment for all eternity. And that will be the most earth-shaking moment in the spirit realm since Eden. Some battles are not fought with weapons, but with authority and order. No blood needs to be shed, because a timely word is sharper than any double-edged sword. This was not a battle like those found in the book of Revelation, where Michael leads the heavenly armies against the red dragon. Nor was it like the battle in Persia in the book of Daniel. He wrestled for days in the thick atmosphere of the spiritual realm. This time, Michael did not strike, did not shout, did not charge. This time he stood between an accusation and a corpse, not to argue, but to await a verdict from the one above every word. But Satan refused to back down. He still stood, not with fire, but with reason, not with a sword, but with a list of charges. In his hand, the indictment wasn't just parchment, it was memory, every drop of Moses' anger, every outburst, every weary sigh among the people. Satan raised the scroll as the ultimate proof, as if forcing heaven to concede. This body no longer deserves to be hidden. He failed, and failure cannot be covered by office or a glorious past. And then, the air grew still. Silence settled like a heavy mist before the arrival of glory. Michael said nothing, and that was the strongest rebuttal of all. Heaven was not silent for lack of words, but because the word was coming. And it didn't need to shout to shake the darkness. Michael spoke only when the moment came. And when he did, it wasn't an argument, it wasn't a defense of Moses. It was just 4 words. The Lord rebuke you. At the moment that phrase rang out, the indictment turned to ash, as if it had just been sealed by the very throne of judgment. Not because Michael had authority over Satan, not because he was strong enough to drive the accuser back, but because he stood on the right side. Authority doesn't come from who yells louder. It comes from who stands behind you when you speak. Michael said nothing more, because he knew. In the spirit realm, humility is a weapon Satan will never wield and cannot withstand. Satan fell because of pride, wanting to be like God. Michael overcame because he remembered no one is like God. And when an angel stands in surrender, no accusation, no matter how sharp, can take root. The tension dissolved, the darkness withdrew. Satan knew he was defeated, not because he was struck, but because he could not touch what had been hidden by God. And Michael turned away and walked from that place. No more words, no more sound. Only a holy silence covered the body, now guarded from all idolatry. God didn't protect Moses' body merely because of his worth. He protected it because a greater theology was being prepared. The new covenant is not built on stone, bones, or rules. It is built on bloodshed by the one who needs no permanent grave. And as if each generation needs to hear this truth again, there are things God hides not because they're unworthy, but because they're too worthy to be worshipped the wrong way. In the next part, we will step into the deeper theology, where everything becomes clear. Why the law had to remain outside the gates of the promised land, and why only grace without form can lead the people home. There is a truth that seems paradoxical, yet it is the very foundation of the gospel. The new covenant is not built on what man can hold, but on what cannot be held: blood. The law was etched in stone, visible, clear, unyielding. But grace is written on the heart, invisible, quiet, fragile, yet powerful. If the old covenant was born through stone tablets, then the new covenant began with a body broken and a stream of blood that never clotted on the hill of Golgotha. And that is why God had to hide the body of the law, because if he didn't, the people would cling to the old and try to build something living on what was no longer alive. Imagine this. Moses, his body was the image of an entire era, an era of commandments, of righteousness through human effort, of laws meant to bring one closer to God. But what would happen if people held on to that body? They would build statues. They would stop there. They would worship what was once right, but no longer aligned. And that is why God hid it. He didn't want his people building a temple around the bones of a bygone age. He wanted them to step into a new life, where they didn't need to prove their worth, but only believe that the worthy one had shed his blood in their place. Have you ever wondered why God won't let you return to certain things? Why do some doors stay closed, even though they once felt sacred, meaningful, or meant to be? Because God knows if you go back, you'll build an altar around it. We're quick to worship what God once used, quick to cling to old roles, old methods, old identities. But the new covenant is an invitation for you then to move forward. God doesn't deny your past. He uses it, but he won't let you worship it. And so, God buries certain things. Sometimes he buries a ministry, a relationship, a dream. Not because it was wrong, but because it is finished. There is a paradox at the cross. What cannot be held on is what saves. You can't hold blood. You can't bottle grace. You can only receive it, believe it, step into it, and then let it define you. Not the things that once were flesh and bone in your old life, If God hid Moses' body, then he will hide a part of your old self too. If God refused to let the law become a refuge, then he is inviting you to step out of your false shelter. And the question is there a part of your life Satan is still trying to claim? The part unburied, the part unyielded, the part is still clinging. Soon you'll see. When Michael confronted Satan, it wasn't just a battle over a body. It was a heavenly principle, a reflection of how you and I fight daily against accusation, the past, and false identity. Get ready to enter the deepest layer of revelation. Some stories don't end with a period, but with a pause. And some people don't need to be buried under stone, but in meaning. Moses was one of those people, from the palace of Egypt to the wilderness of Midian, from the burning bush to Mount Sinai, from the cries of enslaved people to the celebration at the parted Red Sea. Moses journeyed with the people for 40 years, but he never stepped into the promised land. Because he wasn't just a guide, he was a symbol, a living symbol of an entire era, the era of the law. And now, looking back on it all, you must ask yourself, is there a part of my life Satan is still trying to claim? The part unburied, the part you think no one sees, the part you're holding on to, afraid that letting go means losing yourself. Satan still demands. He doesn't need all of you, just the part that remains unsurrendered. Just enough to build a false temple, right in the space meant for life. In that battle, Michael did not attack. He did not shout. He did not argue. He didn't need a sword because he carried authority. He didn't need reasoning because he stood on the right side. The Lord rebuke you. 4 words, enough to send darkness into retreat. Michael didn't defend Moses. He didn't praise his legacy. Because in the spirit realm, nothing defeats the accuser except total surrender to the holy name. Some things were once beautiful, but their time is past. Once sacred, but no longer in the right place. The memory of Moses is worthy of honor, but if misplaced, it becomes a spiritual trap. Just like you, some memories once helped you survive, but now they're holding you back. The glory of your past must never be the reason. You don't walk into your future. If you keep pitching your tent around what used to be, you'll miss what is coming. Are there parts you're holding on to, thinking, God wouldn't want that part? Are there memories you've locked away, believing I don't deserve to be forgiven? That is the very part Satan is demanding. Just like Moses' body, seemingly useless yet still a battleground. And the question is, who will you let touch that part? If you bury it and surrender, it becomes a foundation for grace. If you let Satan take it, it becomes the birthplace of darkness. You cannot win with the past. You cannot win with effort. There's only one way. Stand on the right side. On the side of the name even Michael dared not overstep. On the side of the one who died, rose again, and is fighting for the very part of you that you thought was lost. If Satan still dares to demand a breathless body, do you think he'll leave your soul alone? A soul still breathing, still living, still walking? Write this on your spirit. I will stand on the right side. Because the moment you dare to stand, the angel will draw his sword and the accuser will retreat. When every accusation is melted like morning mist under the sun. When the final silence has roared louder than any thunder. In that place, among the hills of Moab, only one thing remains. The glory of the invisible one. Michael withdrew, not because he was pushed back, but because he knew there was no need to stand a moment longer when heaven had rendered its judgment. Satan retreated, not because his heart changed, but because he could not stand when authority was spoken from the mouth of one fully surrendered. And you are still alive in this world, but also present in an invisible war where every word, every memory, every wound echoes in the spirit realm. If Michael teaches us anything, it is this: you don't need to scream to reclaim the parts of your life that are under accusation. You don't need to strain to hold on to shattered memories. You just need to stand in the right place, under the authority of the one who rose again. When Satan demands a piece of your life, the hidden part, the unhealed part, the part you're afraid to face, you don't need to defend yourself. You only need to whisper in faith, "The Lord rebuke you." And then, as if a decree echoed from the throne of God, the darkness will have nowhere left to hide. If you see yourself in these pages, in the unexplained pain, in the unseen battles no one around you knows, know this: you are not alone. Heaven is watching. The angels are still standing guard, and you are not just a listener of the story. You are a part of it. Don't leave without leaving something behind. Click like if something in this story stirred your soul. Write a comment, not for engagement, but to declare, "I will stand on the right side." Subscribe to Prayer Station, where we don't just retell the Bible, we live in it. Every part, every battle, every whisper from the unseen realm, it will continue to unfold. Because you are not just a viewer. You are a piece of the ongoing revelation. Which spiritual battle do you want the next story to uncover? Comment the name of the Bible book you want to explore. And who knows, you might be the one to unlock the next revelation. Because those who dare to stand on the right side, they are always remembered in Heaven's chronicles.